Hey guys, welcome back to the second episode of SwiftUI combined MVVM application development. This is a continuing series where we already have an app called Green Grocery. So whatever I'm trying to do here is create that sign up view which I had created for the Green Grocery app using Viper architecture. I'm just translating that now to SwiftUI with Combine and MVVM. So whatever we have done already is we have already created that layout using SwiftUI and then use some properties to actually make the data binding happening. So this episode as well as the next one will totally concentrate on using view models to make the binding happening, along with using combine to actually make the API calls, translate those API calls into a combined version instead of the closures which we are using right now. That's the agenda for the couple of episodes which are coming up. Maybe I'll have to take up both of them together. I cannot maybe split it across as a view model episode as well as a combine, because combine and view model are gonna come together and work together. So let's build both of them together. So if the episode is getting bigger and bigger, and maybe I'll take breaks and make it like a smaller ones, and give those breaks at logical periods. Maybe once I have defined a view model, and once I have defined the or included the client-side validations, maybe I'll stop at that and then take it forward in the next episode. Maybe let's just start with the first part of the view model, which is the second episode, by creating those bindings in the view model and do the client-side validations on it. So let's get started. So this is where we are right now. We have this view, and then we have just used some properties to bind these four fields. We have not done anything yet for the sign up view, so that's what will come in the view model side of things. So let's get rid of whatever we have right now here, because I was just showing you how to actually make the binding work. So I was just adding some values and showing that those get reflected when you actually run the application. That's what I had done there. So I'm just getting rid of those things. So now clean slate. Let's just go back to creating a group called view models. So I'm gonna create a view model. Maybe I'll just refer my existing code for that. I'm just named it as sign up view model. So I'll just do the same here. It's going to be a Swift file, sign up view model. So what do we have in this one? So it's nothing but a class model object which is going to implement some properties which are part of combine. So we are already with combine here, because combine is what we will use to make some properties here. Let's create a class called sign up view model, and let's now get those properties to this side, because we already have something called as let's go to our view. We have username, email, password, confirm password, along with the properties to actually show the error messages. So whatever we are going to do is get this out of here into a view model. That's what we are doing right now. So let me just move everything as is to this side. So some of the changes which are going to happen here is I'm going to reflect that. @state is not, we had used @state in the view, but then when it comes to a view model, we have to change it. So whatever we have to make it is, let me just show you that. So we have to first implement something called as an observable object. So to make the view models bindable, in the sense make it aligned to the binding architecture of SwiftUI, we have to implement something called as an observable object, which is coming as part of combine. Maybe just check that observable. Okay, it's already there in foundation itself. Maybe give an error. No, it's fine. So it's part of foundation itself. So whatever was state earlier, which was very specific to the view, is now going to be modified to something called as a publish property. So this is a change we will do. This is nothing but a property, again similar to how a state behaves, but slight differences. Maybe I'll take that up in a later episode where I'll explain each and everything in detail, like what is a published property, what is a state property, what is an environment property, etc. I guess that's what it is called. So I'm just going to make those changes here right now. So this is what it is called, a published property. Instead of, so this property can actually set values, as well as you can use this value property to listen to the changes happening to the same property. So that's how it's going to behave. So properties, it's going to give error on the other side because we have removed all those properties. So published username error, password, confirm password, and the same corresponding errors. So basic changes I have done. So one of the things which we cannot currently use, we can actually do some hack and then make it work, is like we cannot make this view model conform to any protocols. Let's say if I define a protocol like this, call it sign-up view presentable, which is nothing but a protocol which we can actually maybe implement like this, and then grab all these properties and then bring here. It does not work because we cannot have these properties defined here, because it's already using these attribute cases at the rate and all, which is not identified by a property, because these are synthesized properties. So you cannot have it declared within a protocol. So that is one of the disadvantages at this point which I am seeing, where a pure view model approach, where we can actually pass or inject a protocol, will not work. So we might have to live with this in this tutorial. I'll try to figure out how we can do that in a later episode, but then at least in this case we will stick with a protocol. We'll stick with a class which is a view model. At least we can make sure that business logic and every validations are moved to a view model in this episode. At least that's what I'm trying to do here. So I have the sign up view model. So let's start rearranging things here, because it started giving me errors. There is nothing like a username anymore. So we need a view controller. In this view we need a view model injected. So let's do that. So let's create an init and then pass the view model. This is where I was thinking I could actually use a protocol, view presentable or something, and then use it, but that's not working here. And then define a view model. View model is introduced, so it's going to give me error wherever we have instantiated the sign up view, because it is expecting me to pass a view model there. So one of the changes that you will have to make here, it's not going to be a regular property view model object, because if we need to listen to changes happening to this view model, then we need to make it as observable object. that is another change coming as part of combine. So we'll have to include combine here then. Okay, it's actually part of SwiftUI itself. Let me just see. This should be observed object, not observable object. So view model, it's not a part of combine, but it's part of SwiftUI. So any changes happening to view model properties, if it needs to be observed, then we need to make our view models as observed object. Again, not in the scope of defining or explaining what this is, but this is something you'll have to do to make this a bindable view model. So once that is done, we can introduce those properties here. So just like just like we were defining this at $sign, so we'll have to now introduce a $sign before the view model part, because that is what is going to change right now, and then just make it as the same property name, username. Similarly, for the error, there is a small change here because this is not a bindable object. So text value, if you have seen in the last episode, it is expecting a bindable property to be here. So that's why we had this dollar here. Error value does not accept a bindable property, but it just accepts a regular string type. So we can just pass view model dot username error field. That's enough. So that's done. So similarly, we have to do it for each and every field, like even email. Same things. Dot email. It's again like it's a binding string. Email and error being view model dot email error. So 4 of the changes, whatever we need to do is these. View model dot password. So here it should be just plain view model, and error value view model dot password error, and confirm password and confirm password error. Plain view model dot, it has a password error property which is plain string. So 4 things we have bound it. Now it is going to ask me to pass those view models here. So we can just create that. So this is happening on the scene delegate, which is a new thing, which is change which has happened to SwiftUI, where we already have this app delegate. Along with that, we have a scene delegate right now, which is actually responsible for launching your screens, launching your views in that sense. So let's create this view model here. Sign up view model instance, just pass it to content view. So that's enough to make the bindings work. So we also need to do that on the preview section, which is more like whatever we see on this side as a preview whenever we start making changes. So this is more like if you want to stub something, create like a stub view model which does not actually carry your real data, then you can do that somewhere here using another view model, which more be like but we don't have a protocol to conform to at this point. So that would have been great if we could actually crack that, where I can define a protocol and then just inject that within the sign-up view instead of this whole sign-up view model. So this is done. Now it should behave the way it used to be earlier with the properties defined. Let's see that. Building is fine. We have this view model replacing all the properties which we had defined. Still taking a lot of time. Yeah, so loading the view is fine. Let's now start defining the validation side of things, at least just to see whether whatever validation which is required for each and every field, let's say username, it needs to be a required field. Email needs to also be a required field along with email validation on the client side. Password, again, it's a required field, but then it can also have something like strength, which we can define it from this to that length with these characters included. So those kind of things. And then finally, confirm password has to match with password along with the required parameter criteria which needs to follow. So let's define that in the view model side. How we can define it, let's see. So we have the sign up view model. Right now, as soon as you start entering some things to these fields, it's already bound to your properties. So as soon as you, let's say, do a sign up or something, you will get those values there. So let's see how we can define things here. So username, let's start with username required field validation, where once it does not have that value, let's show that error value. Do that, let's go. So I have my view model. So for that, what we need is again, let me say, okay, so let's create let's go to our view model and start creating something like a publisher, which is going to tell my view that a username field is entered with this value and the required field is already taken care or not. So for that, let's simply do something like create a publisher username valid. Let's call it username valid publisher. It should be of type any publisher. So that's one type which is defined in SwiftUI, where you can make any a publisher and then cast it to or erase it to any publisher, so that it can be bound on the UI side. So I'll show you how it works. So at least this one, let's always return a boolean true or false, like username is valid or not, whether I have entered some values to username. If it is valid, let's return to true, else it remains false. Also, let's add something called as an error type called never, which is not an error type but more like don't error this publisher. Means if you have defined an observable type, then it can go through three states. Like it can have a next value, which is more like a signal, where let's say in this username case, you keep entering some values. These are individual signals that you're sending to your through your observable. So whoever is subscribed will keep getting those values. Next state is, let's say it encounters some error. Let's say we define some error case like if email is not valid, end the observable by returning an error, something like that. But it will not make sense in a user interface side, because we need to keep publishing something for the user interface to work. Let's say if it was for API side of things, where if you get a value response from a server, you are only expecting either a success value or an error value. So once you receive an error value, you can always send some signal to whoever is subscribed saying your response has errored out. So you can end your observable at that point. You no need to listen to it anymore. So in those cases, we might just define this as an error. But in a user experience, user interface side, it's always makes sense that the user interface, even if there is an error, we keep publishing something to it so that it keeps getting some values. So no, that's the reason we will keep this as an error. This observable is not never going to error out in the sense it stops sending signals. So if you say set it as never, it is not never going to end sending signals unless we remove this view or just go out of this view or something to some launch a new view or something. Until then it will keep sending some values. So this is how you start any type publisher. So I have defined it as username valid publisher of type any publisher, boolean. Let's say my username is valid or not based on some value that I'm entering in the field, and then never error it out. So this property I can always say return, and I already have a published property defined, which is more like an observable itself. So I can just say username, the publish type. I can always map a value out of it. Map in the sense I'm just transforming my data into some other format and making it another kind of publisher or an observable. So in this case, username is a string observable. So I'm just going to translate it into some boolean observable. So I'll just say map it into $0 will get me the values, and I can always say $0 is my string observable. And if I say if it is empty, like whatever, let's say ABCD is what I entered as the username. So if I check on it as is empty, then it's gonna say no, I'm not empty, I am valid now because I've already entered some value to it. So that's what I'm trying to do here. So that's my value. If it is empty, I'll say no. If not empty, it's a valid kind of observable that I'm creating out of it. So username got translated into a boolean observable by doing this for me. And then I can always say now this is of type publisher, not any publisher. So I need to now convert it into any type, any publisher. I'll just do erase to any publisher. Erase to any publisher is nothing but typecasting, more like how generics works, where in Swift it's more like you need to erase that type to any type, to a type you have defined. So erasure is something out of scope right now. If you're interested, you can go and check how erase to a type works. So that is a concept being done in Java, C#, and all different other languages. You can go and check how it works. So this is a function which Swift has provided, at least SwiftUI has provided, to convert your publisher type to any publisher type. So this any publisher we might have to define as coming from combine. So we already started using combine here. So combine is used on the client side right now, not on the server side of things, where you get a response and you validate and then translate it into a publisher. That's not happened yet. There are different kinds of publishers you can create there. Like it can be any publisher or a future type. Let's see that when we reach there with APIs. So we have defined our first observable to validate our view. For this is what is going to return the error message and show that the required field is missing. That's what we are going to do right now. So we already have defined a publisher which is going to check the username field's value, checks whether it is empty, and then return it as a boolean any publisher observable. We have defined it. So let's create an init. What does the init need? At this point I don't need much here because I have not yet started using any APIs to make a server call to check whether email is already used or not. That's what we will implement as a next step, where as soon as we enter an email, if it is valid, we give a call to the server and see whether I have already used that email to sign up myself or not. So that's something very interesting we'll implement as well along with this, where we'll use futures at that point. So my user valid publisher is already created. So what I can do with that is, as soon as I create the sign up view model on its init, I can just say username valid publisher dot publisher dot receive. There is a function called receive where I can tell my publisher where to receive the values, like in what thread I need to receive the values. In this case, I need it in the main thread because I'm going to send this back to the user interface. So user interface should always be on the main thread. And then this is more like this publisher needs to receive values on the main thread. And next step is more like I need to map that value into something else. Like in something else in the sense, I'm just checking that value and seeing whether it's the boolean value is true or false. If it is true, I'm going to send no response. I mean, if it is a valid username, I'm not going to send an error message there. At that point, I'll just be maybe sending an empty string saying that there is no error. If there is an error, let's say if username is not valid, at that point I'll send across a message to the user interface. Let's do that. $0 is nothing but whether the value which is received from this observable. If there is no value entered, then it's going to be false. If value is entered, it's going to be true. True in the sense it's a valid input. So if it is a valid input, I'm just gonna enter an empty string. If it is not a valid input, then I'm gonna say username is missing. So this is what we are going to show in the user interface as soon as there is a error message problem. So we have mapped the mapping has happened from let's say a boolean value, which is like is valid or not value, to a string value right now. So whatever we right now want to do is just bind it with the property which we have defined to show that error message, which we have already done, which is a username error. Pretty simple, right? You just translate this, whatever username that you are entering, convert it into a publisher, and then just map it back to a error message. You're just using the same observable to create another observable and bind it back to your view using the property which you have defined. So I'm just going to say there is a function called assign run loop has been is something argument type does not conform to expected type subscriber. Let's finish this and see. So I just need to, so before that, let me also do something here to make sure that let's also add a debounce. This is just because as soon as you start typing, you don't need to validate it. Let's say you give it some time so that as soon you enter something and only after the entry is complete, you start validating instead of as soon as you type. So let me just add a debounce. It's called debounce, where I can set it for, let's say, 0.2 seconds, and again make it run in the main loop. Okay, the problem here is it should be receive on run loop.main. So whatever we did is we are already receiving in the main thread. Also we added a delay here so that we don't start validating as soon as you start entering something. We just give some delay so that once I have done with the entry, I start validating. That 0.2 second at least it'll wait until my entry is complete. So that's what the delay is for. I should call it as debounce, not delay. Delay is something else. Debounce is something. So you should call it debounce here. So difference between debounce and debounce and throttle. There are two things, throttle and debounce. Maybe I'll take it up as a different tutorial. So in this case, we are using debounce. Debounce is like you enter a number of things, and it's gonna validate only the nth thing and the last thing which you have entered. So that's the idea here with debounce. And so let's do that map. And this is my username is missing. This is translated. Now I can just say to assign this to a property, which is an observable property. Again, it is asking for a property. I don't think I can associate it to a regular property. So let's just make that change if it does not work. On again, self in the sense this is a property. So the property definition has to happen like this is the naming convention. It works. Okay, that's good then. So I'm just setting this, assigning this value to the username error on self in the sense ViewModel is myself. There is a property called username. So that's where I have assigned it. And then finally you can just say store in any cancelable. This is more like if you are aware of how RxSwift works, you create a disposable object which is actually holding all your observables, and once your class is, let's say, D in it, at that point that whatever is there in the disposed bag will get collected or recycled. So that is one of the ways where RxSwift was how RxSwift was handling memory with related to all the observables which we have defined, let's say. So in this in SwiftUI case, it's called cancelable object. So all these types are conforming to something called as any cancelable. So it is accepting a set of this. So we define an any cancelable set and then keep everything within this, so that once an init happens, we can just remove everything. Or if you're not doing that, even that is fine, because the compiler will take care of it. But I'm just using that pattern here. So let me define that any cancelable bag here. I'll just call it as cancelable bag, more like the convention used in RxSwift. I'm just calling it cancelable bag. It's of type it's a set of any cancelable. So I can keep adding any cancelable objects in this. So this is pretty much the first binding which we have taken care right now. Well, let's just run this and see. It's going to be interesting, because as soon as you start entering something, there's not going to be any error message in the username is missing side, but then once you remove that, it's going to show as username is missing. So it should work like that. Let's see. Run this. Not showing anything right now. Continue. Oh, what went wrong? If not empty, it's a valid one. It should show my error as soon as I remove. So what did I miss? Let's try removing this debounce. Okay, that's the problem because it was validating it wrongly. So I'm just going to get rid of this debounce for this case because debounce is going to make sense when we are making API calls. At least this is not going to block our UI because this is validation is more on the client side. So I'm just keeping this as a client side validation without debounce. It's already saying username is missing. So now it's fine. It works like exactly with the behavior which is expected. So username, valid publisher. Maybe I can do something more here. I'm just trying something like a skip value, at least skip the first entry. I guess that works. That's how you do it. Drop first, it's more like I don't want to see that validation as soon as I load this. It should happen after I start entering something. So let's say now it makes sense. So this is how it needs to be. So I just did a drop first, means at least don't send back the first observable value, like more empty. As soon as this view is loaded, it's checking for that empty state and then sending a signal to the view. I'm just avoiding that right now. So that's what is this drop first is all about. So we did manage to do the first binding properly with this. And the debounce did not work as expected. So I guess I just need to investigate further there whether I need to use throttle or debounce there. I'm just a little confused with both the usage of both in this at least. So let's do that later. So that's more like another tutorial, but we are definitely going to use it when you're making API calls where it makes sense, where I can maybe give a 0.5 seconds of delay before because I'm gonna continuously validate the email address whether it is already used there or not. So once I'm done with entering that, let's stop it, then let's do the validation, which makes sense. So that's the first publisher we created.